101.9 WDET FM, and it's the Metro. I'm Tia Graham. This week, we're joined by Jake Neer of Automotive News. Jake was one of the founding producers of Detroit Today, which was hosted by Stephen Henderson, and co-founder of Mishmashed podcast, which you can still hear on WDET. Jake, welcome back home.
Hey, it's so glad. I am so glad to be here, Tia. This is amazing. I always feel so great to be here in WDET studios. I spent quite a few years in this studio and happy to be back.
Yeah, it's like full circle. We were talking a little bit earlier. I was an intern when you were here, and now to share the mic with you in this capacity is really, really huge. So
that's amazing.
Welcome back to WDET. Welcome to the Metro. Jake, what's happening on the show today?
Well, China, as you may have heard, has been kind of killing the EV game. We'll talk with an expert about why that is and why he thinks China will actually take a huge portion of the global car market just this decade, by the end of this decade.
And what we were talking about earlier, it's quite a huge chunk of the market, so definitely looking forward to hearing this conversation and those who are maybe impacted in the city of Detroit. But first, on the Metro, it's been a while since many of us have had to worry about COVID-19. But during July, it's been on the minds of more Michiganders as the number of COVID cases rose significantly, doubling from over 1,900 from June to July 8th. Even those numbers may not tell the entire story, as Michigan stopped tracking COVID hospitalization data in May, and those cases are only those confirmed by a lab. So, how much did COVID spread in Michigan during July, and how dangerous is the infection at this point? To discuss this and more, we have Dr. Matthew Sims here. He is the Director of Infectious Disease Research at Corewell Health East. Dr. Sims, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you very much.
Yes, so COVID numbers went up in July, but it's hard to know by how much because the state stopped keeping track of COVID cases in May. What do we know about how much COVID cases were up last month?
Yeah, like you said, there's really no good way to estimate it for sure because nobody's really tracking the data the way it used to be tracked, where every test was sent to the state and then every state sent to the federal. What we do know is that the CDC still does tracking. They do a lot of tracking by wastewater surveillance. So one thing we know is when they can detect it in wastewater going up, it tells you that the cases are going up. And it has been going up across the country, particularly sort of in the southeast region. There are some states that don't track that, but in Michigan, it has been going up, not as high as some other states. So the number of cases are probably up. And what, people are sort of saying now is those summer colds you think you're getting are probably not, rhinovirus, the typical cold virus. They're probably COVID.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot of that this summer. Just people and my friends, even people in passing, I have a little cough or I have a tickle in the back of my throat. And like you said, it could possibly be COVID. So, of course, looking for COVID tests and going out and getting tested. What would you say about that right now if someone has a little tickle in their throat or they may just feel like they have something going on? What would you tell them right now?
Yeah, so the majority of COVID cases now are pretty mild. Most people have antibodies against COVID now, whether it's because they've been exposed to it before or because they've been vaccinated or both. And so most people, COVID has really changed from what it was in 2020 to more of a virus that's always in the background. Mm-hmm. And we have lots of viruses that are always in the background. The problem is people who don't have a good immune system, people who are elderly, people who already have problems with their heart or lungs are at more risk for becoming serious. And COVID, as you know, can sometimes still lead to long COVID, which is where you just get these problems with fatigue and concentration and, malaise and all sorts of symptoms that have been associated with it that just go forward for a longer period of time. And people who get that are really, have a difficult time with it.
Dr. Sims, this is Jake Neer with Automotive News here. I'm curious, when it comes to people who have never been vaccinated, does that make a big difference at this point. We keep hearing about the amount of immunity that's just sort of out there at this point. How would this affect someone if they've never been vaccinated? Is that still a concern?
Yeah, it probably less than certainly less than it did once upon a time. Back in late 2020 when the vaccines first became available, immunity was still low. How many people had immunity was still low. The vaccine made a tremendous difference. And I think throughout 2021, even into 2022, as we switched to Omicron variants, which were more contagious, the vaccines really made a huge difference. Right now, I think they help. I think they help keep people's antibody levels higher. But I think that still the majority of people have been exposed and they have natural antibody. Now, the antibodies, whether you get it from vaccine or whether you get it from exposure, will fade over time. So that's why boosting the vaccine is still important. Right now they're boosting usually once a year, right around when we give the flu shot. We still don't know whether they're going to change the vaccine this year or not. It looks like the last vaccine is still protecting against the current variants, so they may say just get a booster, and we're not changing it, or we don't know yet, but we should know that pretty soon.
And if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Dr. Matthew Sims, an infectious disease specialist at Cornwell Health. And he is also covering what's going on with the COVID infections in the state of Michigan. And Jake, you actually had a really good question earlier.
Yeah, Dr. Sims, I'm curious, earlier this summer we were hearing a lot about the bird flu, switching a little bit from COVID. And you mentioned, wastewater tracking earlier in the show. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we were actually seeing elevated levels of bird flu in our wastewater. Whatever came of that? Or is that still a concern? Did we ever see a spike?
It is still a concern. We didn't really see a spike in human cases. We did see human cases, around the country here and there, almost all in farm workers, working with dairy cows, that sort of thing, which is where it was spreading. It was really spreading among the farm animals. But it would every now and again jump to people. There were not a tremendous number of cases. There was a push to get all the farm workers vaccinated against flu to try to help mitigate that. But we did hear cases here and there, but it was not a big outbreak, fortunately.
I guess I'm just wondering do we have a sense of why we were finding that so much in the wastewater if we weren't seeing more in human cases?
Yeah, well, remember the wastewater, you get wastewater from the farms as well. Mm-hmm. And that's probably going to affect it. I would guess, I have not looked specifically at those wastewater numbers, but I would guess that the numbers were higher in areas that were more rural, more farms, that sort of thing, than they were in urban areas.
Yeah, so Dr. Sims, since we have the vaccine now, what's the possibility, we're switching back to COVID here, since we have the vaccine now, what's the possibility that COVID becomes a lot stronger and puts us back in a quarantine-like situation as it happened a few years in the past, or are we seeing that in our rearview mirror?
I'm hoping it's in the rearview mirror. We always have that little worry in the back of our mind. But one of the things that seems to have happened is as viruses, as they evolve, as they be through mutation and whatnot, they tend to evolve to spread faster, right? If the faster it spreads, the more of the population it affects, and whatnot. And when you think about it, it wants to spread. It doesn't want to necessarily kill off the host. Because if you kill off the host, it won't spread as much. So the deadlier viruses tend to burn themselves out faster as they become more just sort of where it can coexist with the population. It makes them sick. You sneeze, you cough, which helps spread it. But it tends to evolve to spread more, but kill less. That's the general way these things evolve. That doesn't mean there can't be an exception every now and again, but generally speaking, right now, and in part because of the changes to the virus and in part because of the fact that we all have immunity, we're not seeing severe cases the way we did. I have seen one or two severe cases, in the hospital over the last year. I just saw one very recently. But again, they tend to be in patients who already have significant medical problems that leads to them it being severe. It's not that the virus itself is so severe, it's that it's severe in that person.
And my last question for you, Dr. Sims, what do we know about long COVID? As of right now, we've had, we've had some years to really collect some data and kind of understand what's going on. So what are we seeing with long COVID,
Yeah, unfortunately, there haven't been any real big breakthroughs in that area. A lot of people have recovered over time. Some people have not. We haven't really found a good treatment for it. We haven't really found good diagnostics for it. It seems to fall, there's different parts. I think part of the reason for that is it's a very complex condition. Some of it is how much it's affected the person's heart. Some of it's how much it's affected the person's lung. Some of it's how much it's affected the person's central nervous system. And I think those are all distinct entities, but they kind of get lumped together. So, there was a big push to do a lot of research on it, but most of the research ended up really focusing on the heart and lung and didn't really focus on that central nervous component that seems to be more common with people, that fatigue and that concentration difficulty and such. So unfortunately, it's really, hasn't gotten too far. I did see, this is going back a few months, a paper where they were looking at actually microbiome therapy, really trying to change the person's gut microbiome. And they had some very promising results with a treatment involving, essentially a very specialized probiotic. But I haven't heard more about that since.
All right. Well, we'll definitely look forward to hearing an update from you. Dr. Matthew Sims is the Director of Infectious Disease Research at Corewell Health East. Dr. Sims, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Happy to be here.
And coming up, we'll discuss a new think tank that centers students' perspectives at Detroit Public Schools.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham, and this week we are joined by Jake Neer. It's like he's never left. It's like he never left.
It feels that way sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. You're at automotive news now. You kind of switched gears just a little bit, but the next conversation, we're talking about kids.
Absolutely.
Students. And you are a parent of students.
That's right. And it's amazing because when I talk to my now 9-year-old and my 5-year-old who's going into elementary school for the first time in this month, oh my gosh, it's this month. It's scary. They have such amazing ideas about the world. And it's like, if only adults could think outside the box like this, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. I love that. We got to remember what the kids think. We got to put our minds where the kids' minds are. And when you consider a think tank, what comes to mind? If you're like me, it's probably a DC nonprofit researching policy, and it's pretty much always led by adults. But something a little different is taking place at Detroit Public Schools. There, Liz Tridon is working to create a think tank around the desires of students. Tridon, the Executive Director of Science and Social Studies at the Detroit Public Schools Community District, hopes to create a social studies student think tank this month. She wants to give young people the opportunity to make suggestions that shape their education. To discuss this now, we have Director Tridon here. Director Tridon, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so where did the idea for a student think tank come from?
Well, I want to go back a few years before the pandemic when our team came on board. We purchased new social studies textbooks for all of our students. We knew when we went to the market, though, that the books were not going to reflect our students. So immediately upon purchasing the books, we knew we had to revise, adapt, and change what we put in classrooms. So we instituted a task force soon after that. It was an 18-month-long process where over 200 stakeholders, teachers, students, district staff, audited all of our materials and scored them with a rubric. From there, we knew, based on the scores that we received, the materials were just not good enough. So we embarked on a full revision process. We hired the best experts out there, Dr. Goldie Muhammad, who's a renowned educator and researcher, the author of Cultivating Genius and Unearthing Joy, to rewrite all of our curriculum. We also hired Dr. David Kirkland, who's also a renowned educator and researcher, who's part of the author of the New York State's Culturally Relevant Instruction Framework, to help guide us too. He runs all of our advising bodies, not just our student think tank, but our teacher think tank and our community advisory council. Now it's time to dig deeper. It's time to invite kids into the process and say, are we getting this right? Have we hit the mark? Or are there some other things that we can do to make sure that what you experience every single day is what you should experience?
I mean, I just have so many questions. Did you start off with the 18 month, 200 stakeholders that you all went through to really audit this rubric, really get down to it? What were some of the things on the rubric that, some of those categories that you all were looking for and checking off?
Yeah, so we use the Great Lakes Center's equity rubric, assessing bias and in standards and curriculum. Some of the categories were selectivity and stereotyping, historical whitewashing, and based on all those categories, our stakeholders scored every single grade level and every single material that students encounter, and then we came away with a set of scores that instructed us on what we need to do to close those gaps.
And just once again, hearing it and going through and breaking through and some of the things you talked about, selectivities, the whitewashing of some of the history and the different things that are in social studies books and textbooks. But I'm thinking about the importance of learning from the students, especially when you pass this down to the students. What are you looking for from them? What do you want to hear from them?
Yeah, so we are going to engage them in a structured process, monthly meetings that we'll do virtually so we can accommodate all of our families across the city. And they will go through our materials much like the stakeholders did, and they will give us feedback. Are our revised materials hitting the mark? Are they not hitting the mark? Do they have, the input that they want to have in the educational experience that they have every single day? We also want to build their leadership skills, so we'll have guest speakers come in to build those leadership skills. One of our partners, Vocal Justice, which believes that empowering students' voice through storytelling is a key way to invite them into, give them ownership in their experience.
And right now we are talking with Elizabeth Tridon, Director of Science and Social Studies at the Detroit Public Schools Community District. And we're talking about a new social study think tank that she's organizing. The question here that in my mind is just building off of that is just trying to find ways to do this in a climate that we're in right now, where we see books are being banned and we see curriculums being banned and we see different things that are being added and taken away. This is really kind of revolutionary in the way that we're thinking and seeing the landscape of the world. So why did you guys decide to do this now?
Well, we're rolling out new curriculum authored by Dr. Goldie Muhammad and others, and we want to make sure that students have the power to say what they learn. They're engaged, in school about 15,000 hours over the course of their schooling experience, 15,000 hours. And to say that they now have the keys to drive their own learning is revolutionary, is powerful.
Now, we only have about a minute left, but I have a big question. When I was actually a reporter here at WDET and a producer, I actually did a piece about how even in some of the best school districts in the state, maybe in quotes because it's how it's measured is, there's a lot of variables there, but that are thought of some of the best school districts, that students of color specifically were still struggling, and part of that is because of the curriculum, because of the way that things were being taught, and sort of contrast that with when I was covering the state legislature. So many education policies came through, and we never heard from students. We never heard from the kids themselves, the people most affected by this. I'm curious, when you approach this, how much of the actual sort of structure of the school system are you trying to push against?
Well, I just would echo the words of Dr. Muhammad. We don't have an achievement problem. We have a curriculum problem. So students want to see themselves every single day in what they learn and experience. So the best way to do that is to do exactly that. Put materials in front of them from people who look like them. One of the core changes that we've made since the task force is in our world geography class. Jessica Nabango, who's a Detroiter and the first Black woman who's traveled to every country in the world, wrote a book. And so that's now going to be our kids' textbook. They're going to learn about the world through the eyes of Jessica.
Oh, I love that so much. And the last thing I have to ask you before we let you go, unfortunately, we're running up on time here, is just about the project itself, the initiative itself. When will we see it really worked within the schools? When will we see the kids actually starting to give you responses? And when will we start to see some of it reflected in the learning?
Yeah, so the application will go live later this month. We'll cultivate as many applications as we can. We're looking for every single student who is interested, and we'll cross that bridge if we have a lot of interest. But it's going to go live this month, and we'll kick off in September with some orientation and some leadership skills building, and then we'll go throughout the year and hear what they have to say.
I love that so much. Elizabeth Trident is the Director of Science and Social Studies Department at the Detroit Public Schools Community District. Director Trident, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. Bring us the updates. Bring us what you find. We want to know.
Thank you. It was my privilege.
Coming up on the Metro, we'll talk about China's sterling electric vehicle industry and why it matters for American car makers.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham here with Jake Neer of Automotive News. Jake, so many cool things that are happening in the automotive industry right now.
And we're going to be hearing about a lot of them throughout this week and from many of my colleagues at Automotive News as well. Tia, I've got a question for you. Have you ever thought about buying an electric car?
I have. And the first one was, I saw the Mach-E, the Mustang Mach-E, and I said, that is something I might dabble in there. That's a beautiful machine. But yeah, I've definitely been interested in looking into the the electric vehicle market because I think it's the future.
And that we're going to be talking more about that tomorrow. But if you haven't heard, China has been really getting into that space right now. Of course, Detroit has been the historic epicenter of the global automotive industry for more than a century. Although foreign competitors from around the world have taken big bites out of America's market share, GM, Ford, Stellantis, they still command a huge piece of the global production and sales, and that continues to fuel the local economy right here in Southeast Michigan. But our next guest says a major disruption is on the horizon, and this time it's coming from China. Michael Dunne is the CEO of Dunne Insights, and he's one of the leading thinkers when it comes to the auto industry in China. Dunne recently wrote in his newsletter that by the end of this decade, China's market capacity could climb to 75% of the world's volume. Of course, that has big implications right here in Detroit. So here to talk more about it is Michael Dunne. Michael, so good to have you on the Metro.
Thank you for having me today. Looking forward to this conversation.
So the title of that newsletter column that I mentioned, Mike, is pretty provocative. It reads, "When every car is made in China." I think a lot of people right here in Detroit might be thinking, what gives? This must be hyperbole, right?
It certainly looks like it, that headline. And in particular, because for most Americans, we just don't see Chinese cars on our roads. So what's the big to-do? But when you think about it, China today presents us with an automotive manufacturing powerhouse, a machine, the likes of which the world has never seen before. Let me just share a few numbers. This year, China will build more than 30 million vehicles. That's 3 times what America makes. China will build more electric vehicles than all other countries combined. When it comes to batteries, China has a 10x lead on us in terms of capacity and production. And then probably most important, China is able to build these cars at 20 to 30% more cheaply than we are here in the U.S. or even in Europe. So we have a challenger coming out of China. It's not a question of if, but when. And the smartest thing we can do is get ready for the competition.
And we should note, I mean, you're not the only one saying this. I mean, that figure that you state in the piece that you wrote about Chinese capacity growing to 75% by the end of this decade, that's a figure from Global Data. That's a highly respected firm that the auto industry itself uses to make its own plans and forecasts. And of course, you're a leading voice yourself on this.
That's right. The Chinese, up until now, have been happy to keep that capacity at home because their market was growing and it was profitable. But that's no longer the case. The economy there has slowed. Growth for demand for cars has slowed. Profits have gone to zero. And here we have the Chinese saying, oh, in order to survive, we must export. And we've seen China last year surpass Japan to become the world's number one exporter of cars. Just recently, I was in Mexico. Few people know it, but China is the number one supplier of cars to Mexico. They're sending great numbers of cars to the UK, Brazil, across the world, everywhere essentially except for the United States. Why? Because they can't stay at home and they have cost advantages that they're taking full advantage of as they go global.
And Michael, this is Tia Graham here. Basic question, why so easy for them to build those cheap cars?
Yes, it's a powerful formula of scale, huge numbers. As in the automotive industry, the more you make, the cheaper your per unit cost becomes. But there's also this factor called state subsidies. At the national level, at the city level, at the provincial level, governments are definitely supporting automakers, giving them things like zero interest loans, free land, discounts on the energy to power their factories. If you can imagine a way for a state to support an auto company, China has already invented it. And that is part of their arsenal. That's one of the reasons they're so cost competitive.
Mike, an important note, I mean, this isn't just the Chinese automakers like BYD or Geely producing cars in China. I believe this figure, correct me if I'm wrong, includes legacy automakers, including the Detroit 3, building cars and trucks in China as well.
And sadly, it looks like a case of if you can't beat them, join them. You're exactly right. We see today that GM, Ford, Volkswagen, even BMW, these companies are turning to China as a production hub for export to markets globally. So this is a really disconcerting, alarming trend. Not just the Chinese automakers are liking their chances exporting out of China, but the global automakers, too, are joining the trend. This has implications, of course, for jobs in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. What if China one day builds all the cars for everybody in the world? Well, that just can't work out well.
Well, if you're just joining us on the Metro, we're talking with Michael Dunne, CEO of Dunne Insights. We're talking about the rise of the Chinese auto industry and what it means for us right here in Metro Detroit. So, Mike, earlier this summer, you and I were both at the Mackinac Policy Conference on Mackinac Island here in Michigan, and you were talking about this very issue alongside members of Congress, industry leaders. What was the response up there from policymakers?
It was a sense there in the room there. The sense was a little bit of alarm, a little bit of shock, because when you think about it, here we are in Detroit, and we continue, Ford and GM, in particular Stellantis, continue to make handsome profits selling large SUVs and trucks to mostly North American customers. And we could be lulled into a sense of complacency. Oh, we're doing terrifically well, and here we are up in beautiful Mackinac and planning for the future. But I guarantee you that after that event, people became aware, wait a second, we're on an island here in the United States, and the rest of the world is shifting to Chinese cars. We better wake up to that new reality.
What a metaphor, right? Yeah. And Mike, last time we talked, I was saying, I was half joking, but this is true. You and I had met a few times for our podcast Daily Drive at Automotive News, but only remotely. And so I wanted to come say hi and meet you in person, but you were just surrounded by members of Congress. Like I could not get to you because they all wanted to pick your brain about what was happening there. And speaking of which, right after your panel with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, I actually got a chance to speak with her one-on-one about this topic. Here's a bit of sort of a supercut of that conversation.
I think what Michael Dunne is saying is very real. And I think that the reason for that is it's being controlled by the Communist Party. They have unlimited resources, they're controlling it, they own it, and that's why we've got to push back.
If BYD or another Chinese automaker wanted to build a multi-billion-dollar factory in Washtenaw County or elsewhere in your district and create thousands of jobs, is that something that you would support or oppose?
My initial reaction would not be the most positive. Are they going to use union workers? What kind? I'd have to know much more about the arrangement before I just make an off the hand. But I don't want communist company running a business that isn't going to treat my workers fairly, pay workers fairly, steal our intellectual property. There are a lot of issues related to that. Simple question, not a simple answer.
It would take a lot of convincing, though.
Correct.
All right, Mike Dunne. So what's your reaction to what Congresswoman Dingell had to say there?
What's interesting, just in the past few weeks, Donald Trump has hinted that he would potentially welcome such an investment into the United States. What's he thinking? If you remember, in his first administration, he put in place tariffs against Chinese cars. The Biden administration has jacked those up to 100%. So there's no way Chinese cars are going to be exported to the United States, but depending on who's our next president, we could see a scenario where, say, Trump says, yeah, bring your $10 billion investment, create some jobs here, build the cars, employ people. We'll take that deal. We won't know until, November who leads this nation next. But the Chinese are hoping for access one way or another to the U.S. market. They know they won't get it through direct exports, and they probably would be very happy to make that investment. Is it in the United States' best interest? As Debbie Dingell said, that takes a lot of careful thought.
Now, there's a beautiful transition to my next question, but before we get there, I want to ask you, what kind of policy prescriptions work here? I mean, I'm sort of baffled by this, Mike. So you can put tariffs on the vehicles, but we have this trade agreement with the U.S., with Canada and Mexico, which is, BYD is interested in building in both of those places. Is there actually anything that policymakers could do to keep those cars out of the U.S.?
One of the options is to take from China's own playbook, and that is when the Detroit Three and others went to China in the 80s and 90s, China said, we'll welcome you into our market with a couple of caveats. Number one, you must form a joint venture with a Chinese company, and that Chinese company will have 50% or greater ownership in that joint venture. So flip the script. China, come on in. We would benefit from the investment. We'd benefit from the tech transfer, and we'd have ultimate ownership control because we'd have 50% or more. Now, that may sound un-American, but in the new world we're stepping into, in order to compete with the Chinese, maybe we just take their formula and apply it back on them.
That's an interesting idea. And could that be written into law? Would that be part of the USMCA?
Right. You can bet that the people in Washington, D.C., both sides of the aisle, will not allow the Chinese to simply build factories in Mexico and Canada and ship in the United States. They will shut that door one way or another. So then they look at, well, the least worst alternative or the next best alternative would be to have the Chinese invest directly in the United States. But we would want to have control over those operations to make sure that we don't have basically, as Debbie Dingell said, Chinese Communist Party controlled companies operating at will in our heartland. That's what we want to avoid. We want to have ultimate say.
So, as I mentioned, you mentioned BYD, and we've been talking a little bit about them building in Mexico. They've already announced that they're planning to find a site for a factory there. Give me, you correct me if I'm wrong. I actually have been out of town the last week or so, and I haven't been keeping up on this, but I believe BYD just announced something about building in Canada as well. What is the status? It seems like BYD and other Chinese automakers kind of want to surround the United States with production capacity before they kind of make their move. Is that right?
That's absolutely their strategy. back in the Civil War, Mao Zedong had this strategy called take the countryside and surround the cities. That applied to a civil war in China, and it was successful. You can see the exact same strategy playing out globally with the Chinese. They're in South America. They're in Southeast Asia. They're in Africa. They're in Europe. They're in everywhere except for North America so far. And now because Mexico and Canada don't have high tariffs, they're starting to export into those markets too. So it's essentially, wow, we're surrounded on all sides. How to proceed from here? That's the big question on the horizon.
All right, well, we got to wrap up here soon, but before we go, you did have another great guest column in Automotive News recently with another provocative title. It says, "There's a potential secret agent parked in your driveway." How concerned should we be about Chinese vehicles and others even stealing our information? And how is that different from the data collection that our cars already do when we're driving around town every day?
You may have seen the news just today that the Department of Commerce came out and said there's planning to ban Chinese software in our vehicles, in autonomous vehicles and other vehicles running in the United States. Why are they thinking about an outright ban? That's because today's autonomous vehicles, today's vehicles have cameras and sensors, inward-looking, outward-facing, that vacuum up all kinds of data about the environment, about your daily routines. What's different about this is that Chinese companies could take that data and ship it back to China, giving them leverage over individuals and potentially our national security. So that's why this is such a big deal. I know that car in the driveway looks innocent enough, but don't underestimate its power to vacuum up data, both personal and national security data.
All right, Mike. Well, let's give the folks in Detroit a minute or so to, breathe heavily into a paper bag or something for a little while. This is a lot for people to take in, I feel like. Michael Dunne, CEO of Dunne Insights, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me.
And you can find more from Mike Dunne at DunneInsights.com and at AutoNews.com.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. Just want to remind you, as a WDET listener, we have the listener survey back. And we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, and you could win some neat WDET swag. It's quick, it's anonymous, and you'll be helping us serve you better. Take the survey now at WDET.org. And thank you. Coming up, the local Detroit group We Are Scorpio has a lot going on this month. We'll have a conversation with one half of that duo next.
They want to see us on the ground, naked and cannot be found. But I'm a Scorpio.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. Right now, you're hearing We Are Scorpio playing their hit song, Scorpio. Jake Neer is here as well from Automotive News. Jake, are you a rocker?
I love punk rock, Tia.
Really?
Yeah, ever since I was a teenager. I still rock out to it today.
So that's right. This is right up your alley. This is what we're doing right now. This month, the local punk rock group has been pretty busy. On Wednesday, the band We Are Scorpio, as part of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy's Black Bottom live music series, they will be performing as a homage to the space that was once Detroit's Black Bottom. And then on August 16th, We Are Scorpio, the local band, will debut its first LP titled We Are Scorpio. And then on August 31st, We Are Scorpio again, along with a host of talented women, will perform at the 20th anniversary of Black Women Rock at the Fillmore Theater. The group includes Detroit Poet Laureate Jessica Care Moore and Stephanie Christian, a singer, songwriter, performer, and music theater artist. She's here now to discuss all the things her group has going on. Stephanie, welcome to the Metro and congratulations on everything you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, if you can, we hear the music, we hear the vibes. Who are We Are Scorpio?
We Are Scorpio is comprised of Detroit Poet Laureate Jessica Care Moore and myself.
And yeah, so what are some of the things that you all stand for? Like, what are some of your influences, especially for your sound? I know that some of the work that you've been influenced by includes Rage Against the Machine, Tina Turner, Alanis Morissette. So how did you guys come together and blend this sound?
Well, Jessica and I have been working together since probably around 2008, 2009, I believe. And Jessica's always been a fan of rock music, and the poetry she had been doing back in New York was definitely rock influenced. And then when we met, she was looking specifically for a black rock singer. And my cousin, who she was dating at the time, was like, I have the perfect person for you. And I went over to her apartment and sang for her, and we've been rocking ever since.
What song did you sing for her?
I can't even remember.
I was going to say, I would have loved to know the first song that she heard you sing, because I know she probably was blown away.
Yeah, it was almost 20 years ago. Yeah, I have no clue.
So I always ask folks, too, when you're from the city of Detroit, what part are you from?
I am from the West Side, and I also grew up in Southfield.
All right. I always ask that to the Detroit native. So we were just talking a little bit, of course, about some of your influences, your vocal influences. You got Rage Against the Machine, but you got Tina Turner and Alanis Morissette. So talk about those two women and how they helped influence your vocals.
Well, I mean, I am a product of the MTV generation, and my mother was totally into punk rock and roll since, I was a baby. She had me at 15, so we kind of grew up together, and music was like our bonding thing. Yeah. And she used to take me to all different types of concerts, and that is really how we bonded. And she played everything from Bob Marley to Tina Turner, Mahalia Jackson, Janis Joplin, and I've always sang rock and roll. It's always been my genre of music. It's not like a gimmick to me or anything. This is what I live.
And that's a really perfect segue, because as a black woman doing rock, punk, number one, we know the origins of the music. We know the origins of in the history of it. But for you to do it, did you ever feel like you were out of place or felt weird, performing rock or listening to rock, punk rock?
I think that I seemed weird to other people, but I never felt weird.
Exactly.
Yeah, I never felt weird at all. I was always like, this is the train you need to get on. You're missing out.
Yeah, this is Jake Neer of Automotive News here, and that brings up a question that we were sort of talking about ahead of the show today, just in the newsroom here at WDET. As I mentioned, I've been listening to punk and hardcore for a long time now, and there are some great bands that are, made up mostly of people of color, the OBGMs, Soul Glow, Bad Brains, Radkey, but still, when I was growing up, the scene was very, sort of patriarchal, white male heavy. But I sense that there is a change happening, and it's been happening for a long time. But I want to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I was going to agree with you. I think, we've always been here. There have always been black people in the genre. Besides creating it, we've always been here. And I think that because we are not necessarily considered mainstream, that people don't recognize our contributions and what we do for rock music. But, this is our music.
Yeah.
Indeed, it is. Right now, if you're just tuning in with us, we're chatting with Stephanie Christian of We Are Scorpio, a local band out of the city of Detroit. Now, We Are Scorpio, you're debuting your first LP, self-titled, of course, We Are Scorpio. Can you talk about creating that and putting that together?
Well, like I said, Jessica and I have been I've been performing with her for almost 20 years. And during COVID was like the first time that either one of us had some real downtime from like touring and performing, whatever, just working in general. And she was like, I can't believe that we've been working together this long. She was like, let's record our rock album. Let's just go do it. And we put a band together, went to New York for 2 days, had like a day of rehearsal, recorded the album in 2 days at Maurice Brown Studio, famous trumpet player. And we just knew it was time. It was so ridiculous that we had not released any music together. So it was perfect timing for us.
Yeah, and Stephanie, just speaking of perfect timing, you guys also are going to be celebrating 20th anniversary of Black Girls Rock.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
Black
Women
Women
Rock.
Rock. Excuse me, Black Women
Yes,
Rock. Let's
ma'am.
get that right one more time. Black Women Rock is celebrating its
Yes,
20th
thank you.
anniversary. And, once again, spectacular just thinking about you all being in this space. 20 years, just really piloting and pushing forward Black people in rock and punk rock and even heavy metal. So if you can't just go into 20 years of it and the importance of maintaining it.
Black Women Rock is an institution. And, Jessica deserves all the things and deserves her flowers because she doesn't give up on it. Like, the city definitely needs to be supporting this movement, supporting this show. We need y'all to buy tickets. We need to sell. This is the biggest venue where we've ever performed Black Women Rock, and we really need Detroit to show up and support us.
Yeah. And some of the things as well, you guys were inspired by Betty Davis. And for folks who don't know who Betty Davis is, can you give us just a little background on who Betty Davis was?
Betty Davis was a singer, songwriter, producer, model, and she's probably more famous for being the wife of Miles Davis.
Yeah.
But Betty is the reason why Miles Davis was able to create like that jazz fusion. Because she was a good friend of Jimi Hendrix, and she took Miles to Jimi, and after that, like, things got different for Miles Davis. So she is one of the contributors to like that whole movement for Miles.
And the thing I loved the most about learning about Betty Davis was I learned it through Jessica Caremore, through We Are Scorpio, through Black Women Rock, because I just, saw the name and I did a little research and I said, oh my gosh, she is the pioneer of what so many of the women are doing today in rock, punk rock. And just for her to do it in such a funky way, especially in the 70s when she was doing it, it was just absolutely inspiring to see that was happening almost 50 plus years ago now.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
and Betty was a force.
Yeah, she was. Yes, she really was.
A force. Yep.
So when we talk about Black Women Rock celebrating its 20th anniversary, if you can't just go into a little bit of it again, like you said, it's the biggest venue you guys been able to perform at the Fillmore. So go ahead and give us the rundown.
Well, Black Women Rock is about showcasing women in this genre who are emerging, who are established, and it's a day of sisterhood and just the power that these women bring on stage and like bring to this city is palpable. Like, it's such an amazing event. And this year we're going for, I think it's 20. I think we're trying to have 20 performers to celebrate the 20 years. Like, it's something that you really, really, really do not want to miss. It's very, very inspiring.
All righty then. Thank you so much. Stephanie Christian is a member of the local band We Are Scorpio. You can catch their new debut, the first debut actually, We Are Scorpio, coming out August 16th. You can also catch We Are Scorpio August 31st, along with a host of talented women at the 20th anniversary of Black Women Rock at the Fillmore Theater. Thank you so much for being here with us on the Metro, and we look forward to having you in studio soon.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Afraid to look into our eyes. We know your dreams are wet, and we haven't come over yet. Your enemy, your closest friend, your worst nightmare, your big.
All right, make sure to come back tomorrow on the Metro. And let me ask you this question. Is now the time to consider buying an electric vehicle? We'll open up the phone lines to hear your take on whether you're interested in buying an EV in 2024 and why.
Indeed. As well, don't forget the WDET listener survey. It is back, and we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, and you can win some neat WDET swag. It's quick, it's anonymous, and you'll be helping us serve you better. Take the survey now at WDET.org, and thank you. That's the Metro. For Monday, August 5th, you can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. And the show is also on YouTube if you like listening that way. The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt. Additional production support from Sydney Walkley. Our engineer is Nate Bender, and music's done by Sam Bobian and Will Sessions. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and you want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at WDET.org/donate. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Jake Neer and I will be back tomorrow.